George never believed that physics could be funny. He had been working on the same experiment for years, and while the rest of his colleagues had moved on to more pressing problems in the world of science, George's singular obsession remained the black hole. His black hole. No one else had the guts, or the imagination, to work on something so controversial, so absurd. Everyone else was racing to cure diseases or save the planet from climate change. George? He was trying to capture the universe's most enigmatic force, the thing that could bend time and space, and squeeze it into a miniature model. He was the joke of the physics department, and he knew it. And it wasn't just because of his obsession with black holes. No, it was the fact that George had somehow managed to screw up every single experiment in the last decade. So, when he finally gathered the courage to present his big breakthrough, a tiny, theoretical black hole he'd been toying with in his lab for months, his colleagues didn't expect much. The lab was a mess, as always. Papers and empty coffee cups littered the countertops, and tools of various sizes and purposes were scattered on the floor. At least George's idea of order was consistent. He stood in front of his makeshift contraption, a strange, swirling device constructed from wires, metal, and something that vaguely resembled a vacuum cleaner. His audience consisted of two people, Sarah, the lab manager, who only showed up when she needed something from him, and Rob, the new grad student who had no idea what he was walking into. "You're sure about this, George?" Sarah asked, adjusting her glasses and eyeing the contraption suspiciously. "You know what happened the last time you tested one of these things?" George flashed her a grin. "Oh, come on, Sarah. This is going to be different." Rob looked at the machine and then back at George. "How can we be sure? It's not exactly standard protocol, right?" George rolled his eyes. "This isn't standard physics. It's fun physics." With that, he flipped a switch. The room hummed with energy as the machine whirred to life. There was a brief, unsettling pause, followed by a bizarre, high-pitched whine. The swirling black mass in the center of the contraption expanded, pulling everything nearby into its center, papers fluttering in the air, the metal frame of the device twisting like a piece of aluminum foil in a trash compactor. George grinned, eyes wide. "See? Perfect. Mini black hole." "Watch." Before he could finish his sentence, a high-pitched pop sounded from the center of the device. Everything went wrong at once. The world around George seemed to collapse into itself. The walls of the lab twisted and bent like they were made of rubber, and a powerful gravitational force pressed down on his chest. For a split second, time itself seemed to freeze. Then, there was nothing. When George opened his eyes, he was no longer in the lab. He was lying on a beach. He sat up, his head spinning. His clothes were still the same, his oversized hoodie, a pair of jeans, and the sky above was a familiar shade of blue, but something felt off. The waves lapped at the shore in a rhythm that was too slow. The sand felt too soft, like it was melting beneath his fingers. He looked around, confused. A few feet away, he saw a strange structure rising from the sand. It looked like an ancient temple, or at least, a bad replica of one. What the hell? His heart began to race. He stumbled to his feet, trying to make sense of what was happening. His mind was spinning. He had just been in the lab, hadn't he? Testing his black hole. So, how the hell was he on some beach in what looked like another dimension? Suddenly, a loud voice behind him shouted, "Hey! You're in the wrong spot." George turned around quickly. Standing there was a man dressed in what looked like futuristic armor. The man held up a strange, glowing device in his hand and pointed it at George. "What the hell are you doing here?" the man demanded. His voice had an eerie calmness to it, like he was used to dealing with people who didn't belong in his dimension. George started, still disoriented. "I'm not exactly sure. I was just in my lab, and then I think I fell through something." The man raised an eyebrow. You fell through something? You must be joking. You're on Zorith 7, not Earth. Earth is, well, it's not even a thing anymore. George felt his stomach lurch. Wait, what do you mean? What is this place? The man sighed, looking at George as if he were explaining something to a child. You've opened a rift. The black hole you were working on? It's a key to travel between dimensions. You've gone and made a mess of it. George's mouth went dry. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to, yeah, well, you've been messing with things you don't understand. And now you've pulled this dimension into a spiral. That's what happens when people like you start messing with dimensional travel without understanding the consequences. George took a step back. How do I fix this? The man paused, eyeing him with a strange intensity. You can't. Not by yourself, anyway. The damage is already done. As if to underline his words, George felt a sudden, strange tug in his chest. He glanced around at the sand beneath his feet, watching as it began to disappear, sucked into an invisible vortex. A small piece of a distant mountain crumbled into the air and vanished, as if eaten by some unseen force. Whoa, George whispered, barely able to comprehend what he was seeing. I didn't do that, did I? The man nodded gravely. Every time you travel like that, you consume the very fabric of the universe you're in. And you leave a trail of destruction behind you. George's heart sank. So, every time I jump, I destroy everything? The man looked him dead in the eye. Not just everything. Everyone. George's heart raced as the sand beneath him continued to dissolve. The beach, the waves, the distant mountain, everything was vanishing as if someone had pulled the plug on a cosmic bathtub. He instinctively reached out, trying to grab onto the ground, but his hands slipped through the thinning surface, and the grainy sand dissolved like water between his fingers. He felt a pull in his chest, a sensation like being yanked through a tunnel by an invisible hand, and suddenly he was falling, weightless, through a blur of light and darkness that he landed in a heap on a cold metal floor. Groaning, he pushed himself up, his head spinning from the disorienting feeling of traveling through space-time. For a moment, he thought he might have fallen into a dream. Maybe he was still in the lab, hallucinating after the machine malfunctioned. But then he looked around and saw the truth. This was real. He was standing inside a vast metallic room, more like a spaceship than anything he'd ever seen. The walls were lined with complex, glowing panels and screens that flickered in languages he didn't understand. The air smelled sterile, almost like plastic and metal. A voice from somewhere behind him broke the silence. Are you going to just stand there all day, or are you going to explain yourself? George turned to find a woman in a sleek, silver jumpsuit, holding what looked like a futuristic tablet. Her sharp, blue eyes studied him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She seemed unfazed by his disoriented state, as though encountering a lost traveler from another dimension was just another Tuesday for her. I don't know how I got here, George mumbled, rubbing his temples. I was just, right, she interrupted. We know. You're a dimensional jumper. We've been tracking your little experiment. She looked at him with a frown. You've been causing quite a mess, you know. George's stomach twisted. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to what? Make a pocket black hole? She raised an eyebrow. Congratulations. You've unlocked something the entire Galactic Council has been trying to contain for centuries. Dimensional rifts. The kind of rifts that destroy everything in their path. She gave him a hard look. And you have no idea what you've really done, do you? No, I don't. But I swear, I didn't want any of this. I was just trying to run an experiment. I thought it would be small. Safe. Safe? She shook her head, almost laughing. Nothing about black holes is safe. Certainly not the kind you're playing with. I didn't know, George's voice caught in his throat. He had no idea what he was doing. He hadn't even fully understood what the black hole could do in the first place, let alone the consequences of tearing open dimensions. I didn't mean to cause all this. I just wanted to fix things. The stuff in my life. The woman seemed to soften, just a little, her expression becoming less stern. Look, I'm not here to lecture you. But you need to understand the consequences. The dimensional fractures you're leaving behind, they're not just disrupting this universe. You're affecting others, other timelines, other realities. People, beings, are disappearing. Entire worlds are being erased. All because of your little experiment. George's chest tightened. I didn't know. How do I fix it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past him to the large, circular window on the far side of the room. Through it, George could see stars and galaxies moving, but it was more than just the usual view of space. It was as though the very fabric of space itself was warping, bending unnaturally. He felt a chill run down his spine. This is what happens when you open a rift, she said, her voice almost cold now. Time, space, reality, they're not meant to be bent, twisted, or toyed with. You can't undo the damage, but maybe you can stop it from getting worse. George swallowed hard. He felt a lump in his throat. How? You need to find the heart of the rift, she said, her eyes hardening. The core of the black hole you opened. It's the only way to close it and repair the damage. But it won't be easy. A chill ran through him as he glanced at the distortion in space outside the window. He could almost feel it, the void in the fabric of reality, like something pulling at him from every direction. But something about her words stuck with him. Maybe you can stop it from getting worse. He nodded slowly, though he had no idea what he was getting into. How do I find it? You won't. Not on your own. The woman gestured to a panel on the wall, and a holographic map of what looked like multiple interconnected dimensions blinked into existence. It was a chaotic mess of swirling lines and broken paths. But I know someone who can help. The next few hours felt like a blur. The woman, who introduced herself as RYL, guided George through the facility, though facility didn't seem like the right word for the massive, interdimensional station that stretched for miles beneath their feet. It was more like a spaceship, only far more advanced than anything George had ever seen, with corridors that stretched in impossible ways, twisting in and out of multiple dimensions simultaneously. There were beings here that George could barely comprehend, some humanoid, others not. Some had multiple eyes, others were completely transparent, like ghosts caught in time. They moved like shadows, existing between moments. Where are we? George asked as they walked through one of the corridors, the walls flickering and shifting with strange symbols. Welcome to Nexus Station, RYL replied. It's a hub for dimensional travelers, a neutral zone where the Galactic Council monitors and, when necessary, contains dangerous rifts. It's also the only place where you'll get the help you need. George frowned, his mind struggling to catch up. The Galactic Council? Nexus Station? RYL looked at him, her expression unreadable. You're not from around here, are you? George chuckled nervously. Yeah, that's a bit of an understatement. She didn't smile. Instead, she led him into a room where a large holographic display sat at the center, surrounded by other beings. A tall, alien figure with translucent skin and several long arms stood before the display, manipulating it with swift, graceful movements. When the alien noticed George and RYL, it turned and made a series of clicking noises, almost like a question. This is Core, RYL said, introducing him. He's the one who can help you. Core nodded slowly, his many eyes scanning George as if seeing through him. You caused a lot of damage, human, Core said, his voice like the ringing of 1,000 chimes. But perhaps, just perhaps, you can fix it. If you're willing to make a sacrifice. A sacrifice? George repeated, though he wasn't sure he was ready to hear the answer. Core's long arms moved again, and the display shimmered, showing a swirling image of a black hole, its core glowing with an unnatural light. The heart of the rift is inside that black hole. You must travel to it, navigate the distortions, and shut it down. But be warned, the black hole is alive. It feeds off your every decision, your every thought. George's stomach churned. I don't know if I can do this. I didn't even mean to. You don't have a choice, Core interrupted. The longer you wait, the more you'll destroy. The more universes will collapse. George stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. He had no choice. He had to go. But even as the words left his mouth, a voice in the back of his head whispered something he couldn't ignore. What if you fail? What if you make it worse? RYL stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. If you want to stop this, you'll need to trust us. And trust yourself. You might not have the power to undo everything, but you can still fix some of it. George's heart was hammering in his chest as he stared at the shimmering, distorted image of the black hole on the holographic screen. His mind was racing, every instinct screaming at him to turn away, to find some way out of this impossible situation. But deep down, he knew there was no escape. Not anymore. RYL and Core were silent as they watched him, waiting for his decision. The tension in the room felt thick, suffocating. Finally, George took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He had caused this. He had to be the one to fix it. I'll do it, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves coiling in his stomach. I'll go. Core gave a subtle nod, his many eyes narrowing as if to scrutinize George's very soul. You understand what this will require. The black hole you've created is a living thing. It won't let you leave easily. Not unless you confront it fully. I understand, George said, though the words didn't feel like enough. How could he understand something like this? How could anyone? RYL's hand was still on his shoulder, offering a quiet support that he desperately needed. We'll guide you as far as we can, she said. But from here on out, you'll be on your own. The rift is yours to control now. A strange, almost overwhelming sense of finality filled the room. George didn't look back. He didn't even let himself think of the consequences. He had no other choice. Without another word, Core pressed a button on the console in front of him. A portal swirled open, the air rippling like a water surface disturbed by a stone. A jagged line of light appeared in the air, stretching wide enough to step through. Go, Core's voice echoed from the shadows. George took a step forward, his legs shaking beneath him, and then he crossed the threshold. The moment he passed through, everything around him blurred. The air grew thick, like trying to breathe underwater. Time itself felt like it was stretching and contracting, snapping back on itself in strange and painful ways. He could feel the pull of the rift all around him, tugging at him, as if the very fabric of space was alive and aware of his presence. He stumbled forward, instinctively reaching out, but the ground seemed to shift under his feet, and he was plunged into darkness that it was like falling, but without the sensation of motion. For a long moment, he was lost in the void, unable to tell up from down, until, thud, he landed hard on the ground. He grunted as he pushed himself up, blinking to clear his vision. He was in a vast, empty expanse, a place that felt like the heart of nothingness. A void that stretched on forever, with no horizon, no stars. The air was cold, but not the kind of cold that stung. It was more like the emptiness itself had drained all warmth from the world. He could hear a low hum in the distance, vibrating through the very fabric of the space around him, and for a moment, he thought he might have gone deaf from the silence. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on nothing, and then he froze. He wasn't walking on solid ground. The surface beneath him, if you could call it that, was made of fractured light, like jagged glass, shattering into infinite reflections of himself. Everywhere he looked, his own face stared back at him, distorted in 1,000 ways, stretched and compressed in impossible shapes. The black hole's core, its heart, was in front of him now, hovering in midair. It was a pulsing mass of light and darkness, constantly shifting and folding in on itself. The rift. The reason everything was falling apart. It wasn't just a thing, a force of nature. It was alive. As he walked closer, the air thickened, and a deep, resonant voice seemed to come from all directions, reverberating through the space around him. You cannot undo what has been done. George's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't tell if the voice was in his head or if it came from the black hole itself. It was just there, like a presence, a weight that settled into the very core of his being. You've torn the fabric of reality, the voice continued. And you are no longer a part of it. You belong to me now. George clenched his fists, willing his voice to be heard, even though he felt small, insignificant, like a fly in the presence of something ancient and unstoppable. No. I won't let you win. I have to fix this. The black hole pulsed, and the ground beneath his feet fractured even more, sending shards of light scattering into the void. The edges of the rift expanded outward, threatening to swallow everything in its path. The further he stepped forward, the more he felt it, the suffocating weight of time and space crumbling around him. I am time and space, the voice boomed. I am the force that bends, twists, and consumes. You cannot stop me. You can only delay your own destruction. George closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what he had to do. He had to face it. He had to shut it down. But the black hole wasn't going to make it easy. How do I stop it? He remembered what Core had said, the rift was alive. It fed on thought, on choices. It wasn't just a thing he could shut down. It was intertwined with his own actions. Every choice he made, every hesitation, every second spent dwelling on the consequences, was feeding the rift, making it stronger. He had to think. He had to stop overthinking. Suddenly, it hit him. The heart of the black hole wasn't just a thing to be shut off. It was a part of him now. The black hole was feeding on his mistakes, his desires to fix things. But the one thing it couldn't feed on was acceptance. He stepped forward, not fighting, not struggling, but accepting. The rift didn't care about his hesitation anymore. The more he accepted the truth, that he couldn't change everything, that he couldn't undo what he'd done, the less the rift seemed to grow, the black hole seemed to waver, its pulse weakening. The hum of its voice turned quieter, more distant. You cannot stop what has already begun. But George wasn't listening anymore. He focused all his attention on the core, the heart of the rift. It was no longer just a thing to be feared. It was a part of him, and he had to let go of the idea that he could control everything. With that realization, George closed his eyes and whispered one word: enough. The rift seemed to pause, as if in disbelief. The light in the black hole flickered, then dimmed. A crack appeared in the center, and for the first time, George felt the pull begin to slow. The distortion in the air calmed, and the jagged shards of light shattered into nothingness. The black hole collapsed on itself, slowly at first, like a dying star sinking into its own gravity. The air around him began to stabilize, the oppressive weight of the void lifting. And as the rift closed, George felt something inside of him shift, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The strange, suffocating pull that had gripped him throughout this journey began to fade, until, at last, the black hole was gone. For a long moment, there was silence. Then George opened his eyes. He was back in the lab. Everything looked the same. The machines, the papers scattered across the floor, the familiar hum of the lights. The world was exactly as it had been before he stepped into the rift. But there was something different now. He could feel it, a subtle change in the air, in the way the world moved around him. It was almost like he had never left, and yet, he knew he had fixed it. He had stopped the rift, and in doing so, he had saved the fabric of reality from unraveling. But there was more to the story. More to the choices he would make that it wasn't over. Not really, but it was a beginning, and for the first time in a long time, George felt like he was ready to face it.